phrase I used was crack the Imagine Dragon versus the fiddling with the points. And you spoke of this actually in a fairly self-critical way, like you had gotten trapped and lost something. And so I wanted you to tell me just a little bit more about that before we totally dive into it.
I think it was like my very first experience of playing was I had very little awareness of the mechanics. I must have been 14 or 15 years old. And I just remember, the GM would describe something, and I would see it like it was in front of me or on the table, right? And I was just totally engaged with it as if it was real, wanting to interact, not thinking about points or the strategy of what kind of creature is this. It's just a creature I'm interacting with. And the funny thing is, my first impulse was to try and talk to it. Turns out it was a creature that you just didn't talk to.
Right.
But so
I get that.
It just engaged my imagination. And then, as I got into the game more, I wanted to recreate the experience, I think. And, but as I learned, particularly with chivalry and sorcery, they went very mathematical, at least for games of that time. And it became a lot of what you call, pre-game stuff. Where you create characters, design stuff. And I think that it kind of, it's just the beginning of me getting lost in points, because I picked up the champion system and then translated from there to Fantasy Hero. I spent most of my
You'll spend a lot of time taking dividends and figuring, how this fits with that, and then I've got 5 more points than I thought. I got to go back and So I believe me, I've lived that, and I'm still living it in many ways. So I know what you mean.
And I became a GM very early on.
Right.
So when I got into the hero system, I was just pointalizing all over the place.
Sure, and there's an interesting thing going on here that I'm really hammering with Champions now. Specifically, that in the original first generation Champions, tons of things are not bought by points. Being a millionaire is not bought by points. Fourth edition was GURP-sized, bluntly. So now anything and everything, status, anything, if you didn't pay points for it, you didn't have it. Period.
Yeah.
Whereas first generation champions, well, everybody did, and I would even say that the champions team got seduced by it when they started really saying, "Ooh, heroes system," and the same thing really. Okay, we're talking about something very basic: is or is not the world, i.e., what we can imagine that has any identity in the game, built with points or not? And I would even go to say that viewpoint was perfected, and I mean perfected. You can't fix it or change it or improve it with DC Heroes.
Which I'm not familiar with.
Well, believe me, there's a single universal table, and every imaginable metric is rated in points on that table. Every imaginable metric. And then that's related to the pips on the dice rolls. So it is just insanely clear. This is a football. Bam, you know where it is on the table. Done. And the interesting thing I'm trying to get at is that first generation Champions doesn't have that. So how do you work with the things that aren't made of points when they involve very, very concrete activities in game? It's not just skin. It's not just fluff. It's not inconsequential. But it's not points. So so I really grappled with that. And I kind of rolled into, I was kind of lucky in some ways when I got very GURPSy and we tried to play a game set in Cynosure, which is one of these interdimensional cities in comics. I don't know if you're familiar with it, from Grimjack.
Vaguely.
and I was playing with the author of the comic. So so we were really pumped. We were like, this system can do, here it comes, wait for it, Alan, anything.
Oh,
right?
Yes.
The points. You got it. The points will do anything. And I quickly found that, yes, they could do anything as long as anything was exactly the same as anything else. And so so what I'm driving at is that I got kind of a lesson in putting that ideal aside. And so I got to thinking, what are spending points really for? What's all this math really for? So before I go into that, and because I've got a thing, there's a thing, that I want to say.
You're excited about something.
I know, but I don't want to steamroll your point, which you are articulating really, really well. So the first thing I want to do before I slip down my slippery slope is to ask you, I mean, it's been a long time since 1986.
Yes.
So what's been fun since then?
What's been fun since then?
I mean, in that way that you were talking about.
Well, the thing is that, and I realized that back when I was running Fantasy Hero in 85, 86, whatever, our cat.
Hello, Kitty. Yeah.
That I was doing a lot of stuff where I was essentially just responding to the players and creating, not really railroading anything, but kind of creating things. And I felt I was doing it wrong because I would like improvise sessions and, spitball DVDs and this kind of thing for monsters that I came up with just to unfold activities my characters do. And yet at the same time, I was deeply fascinated with this idea that Champions had put forward, or Hero had put forward about here.
No, that's all right. The cat can play too. Yeah. But this idea that Hero had put forward that
points would define the universe.
Right.
And so I felt there's this contrast, and part of it is my personality too. I like to put things in procedures in order and figure things out, right? So I felt like if I was not proceduring everything that was important, had impact into the game, that there was something wrong with what I was doing.
Right. And this is a really fascinating trap to get into, because I've pinballed myself back and forth on this. Specifically, that one form of the pinball is to be very rejectionist and say, screw all the numbers. Math is evil, right? This is terrible. Well, I want to get back to my 14-year-old romance. I want to imagine. I want to, I want the joy of childhood. I want my innocence back.
Yep.
And if we could only do that and get really groovy and just spitball and talk and, play. Now, you see, this is funny because saying play in this sense is a good thing. Don't get me wrong. We did come to play. And I mean to play in like a really nice sense of the word. And so, so I don't want to lose that, but we can get too romantic and say that there was something very ineffable and mystic and innocence about it all, and those fucking numbers came along and ruined it. Oh, and I don't want to, and I'm saying that viewpoint, that dichotomy, that's not where I'm going with this. I've got another slippery slope.
I just wanted to say, I'm a psychotherapist, and I've got a couple books on the value of play and how it is. It's an important thing for the human species, and it allows us to access parts of our brain that allow us to learn in safe ways.
I completely agree with you. I think it's really important not to lose that word. Funny, and for all of the fact that I think the word role-playing is a completely historical thing for what we do. I mean, it's a historical term. It just, we were landed with it. And not to overemphasize or overanalyze the term role-playing. If we were to look at that word, I would vastly, vastly prioritize the play over the role.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I think,
So
that's what, as I'm beginning to see it, is all of the structure that games provide is a holding place, a crucible in which chaos happens, and you play in the chaos. Right?
Totally. And so this is the funny thing when we're looking at a fairly heavy rules set, like any of the ones we're talking about. If we're looking at a fairly heavy rules set, and then we say, okay, is this ruining play, or how do we play with it? Is this? I mean, you can play with some pretty complicated toys. You can play with some pretty complicated games. I hate those terms, toys and games, too. Let's not overemphasize specifically what they mean. Shall we say devices? Whatever.
Yeah.
Instruments, procedures. Here's what I'm getting at. I found, and it was Champions that did this, that when I made a Champions character, and this is what the best part is that I'm talking about villains. Villains taught me this. That if you made villains such that they were in motion, you look at the arrangement of what you had paid points for, such as the disadvantages, such as the powers, such things that crisscross and interact with each other. If you set it up and it made the thing go, you're looking at the sheet and you're like, hot damn, I know exactly what this person is going to do, what they must do. And I've got
the energy driver, the emotional core.
It's no surprise that villains taught me this rather than heroes, because fandom and certain aspects of role-playing training lead you to do portraiture with your character creation, not engine driving, but static portraiture. And I finally, after years of Champions villain making and hero making and playing both, being a GM, being a player, years, I finally said, I get it. If you do a portrait with your 250 points, it's just going to sit there.
Yeah.
Even if it's a portrait of a character, like it's highly influenced by Iron Man or Guardian in Alpha Flight, which was everybody, fucking late 80s, every group had a Guardian in it. And, however much portraiture was involved, if the character was dynamic in the comics, but your portrait wasn't. And the points were perfect in terms of freezing something into place.
Yes.
And I was looking at it and I was going, I get it. And then other games, I was trying some of the White Wolf games in the early 90s, and I realized that the characters weren't built to grow. They weren't built to grow. In fact, in many ways, the texts, if you go back and read those and similar texts, you'll find they kind of hate the advancement system. It's 2 pages long, it's stuffed in the wrong place. It's kind of like they didn't really want to do it, but they had to have it in the book, And you realize why. Because your very carefully chosen little things all made a character, and to alter it just fucked it all up. So and so that taught me a slightly related lesson. So I said, okay, what we want is...
Can I reflect something here?
Yeah.
So you may remember that I posted a Champions Now character, Thunder.
Yes, and I really liked it, absolutely.
I fiddled with it initially, and then I think I said this on the forum, is that I had this moment when I discovered the sight limbs and a bunch of other things about the character's personal life just went click for me.
Absolutely.
And I felt there's this kind of magnetic tension between where she is now and what's
going to happen with her husband. And it's not just, oh my God, my hunted shows up and he's my husband, so now we can do this little banter, this superficial, banter of exes. No, you're actually kind of interested in whether this relationship can go somewhere. And whether it needs to break off and change, or maybe there's something, between the relationship that we value, perhaps. We won't find out until we actually see them. We have to find out. And this is where the GM and the player can have a weird meeting of minds where the player's kind of like, wow, unexpectedly, I kind of like the husband. I can see why they don't get along. There's history here. I'm playing my character as emblematic of that history too, but audience-wise, I want to see another scene with these two. I can't wait until he shows up again.
Yeah, it's very much. I've been rereading old Peter Parker.
Yeah.
It's very much like all the stuff he gets wrapped into while he's in high school. I skip ahead to just read the sections about his personal life.
I was going to say, that scene, people forget the Lee stories. They really do. And, to everybody, it's the origin, and then it's the Goblin, and then it's Gwen Stacy dies. And you're kind of like, no, actually, that's not actually what the first 100 issues are about.
The dialogue is clunky and expository, and yet there is that thoughtfulness behind it. So,
Flash is a much more positive character, I think, than most people realize or remember, too. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's only kind of a serious dick in the first couple issues, and then after that, he you can see they just don't get each other. Okay, so here's my slippery slope.
Let's get back to your point, though.
Okay, which is this. And one last anecdote about a game. This is in the late 90s, and we're playing Legends of the Five Rings. Last step in character creation is to answer 25 qualitative questions about your character. 25.
Holy moly.
Right. And this is after all the point balancing, too. So, and I answered them, and I found myself looking at it, and I said, and every one of them stopped. None of them said, what is he going to do? None of them was, how is this contradicting that? Nothing. It was flat. The character was done. That's the problem, is you got your character done? Yeah, I got my character done, and I realized it was way too literal. And so, and I said, okay, that's it. We got to have, that's where the kicker comes from, is thinking in those terms. What's the...
So you're talking about questions that set players up to answer questions about, this happened in my past, and it's basically resolved.
Right. Or how does he feel about his father? That you could answer that, and you could inject something unstable, but it's not primed for it. And so anyway, so I said, let's go back now. Does having the complex numbers of something like Chivalry and Sorcery, or the complex numbers of the hero system, or as I prefer to think of it, as first generation champions, where my heart is. And I found that was the key, that it wasn't the complexity of the numbers. There's aspects of the numbers that were seductive, that spun us off somewhere. Guy at the Forge, many years ago, wrote that he, for his entire life in pop culture, had thought of role-playing games as, get this, quantified cliff notes for genre.
Genre,
right?
Oh,
think about that for a second. Yeah, I know. I mean, I remember reading this. I mean, poor guy, he's a friend, and this was a long time ago and all the rest of it. He was reminiscing or reflecting when he said this, so I don't want to come down on him, but a chill ran down my spine. I was like, that's terrible. And so, and I'm a guy who likes my systems. I like numerical stuff. I love the statistics, and I love making the characters and all that. But it was only after I realized that it was the dynamism that can really prompt that attracts me. And a lot of the games that are much less numerical, I actually have to tolerate them. A lot of the sort of games that we think of, I mean, I remember at the time, late 90s, it was all the Window, which was, one of those, you remember the Window, right? And so all sorts of things like it that were very much, okay, list 10 things about your character, go. Assign a die to each one of them. And that's okay, and it's got its place. But that's when I look and say, okay, now when do the numbers matter in such a game like that? I'm still looking at the numbers, but I'm looking at their dynamic contribution to instability and momentary resolution of instability. I'm speaking too fast. Problem number one is portraiture for its own sake, which means everybody sits around like stones and gets their little stones moved from place to place by the GM, and pretty soon everyone realizes that this is as much fun, as I like to put it, as playing football with a wet rag instead of a football. I mean, you can do it. You really can. You can follow all the rules. You can do it. But, the thing you're using isn't going to be any fun. So
you're talking about something like in Chivalry and Sorcery, I might come up with a man-at-arms who goes out, and there was a lot of dungeon delving in the game.
Absolutely.
And, but he's he's just, it's like a fighter in early D&D. He's just a character, a portrait.
Right, and even if he's incredibly detailed, even if you roll for your eye color, even if you roll for exactly how many silver pieces he has in his job and all that stuff, it doesn't make any difference. But the important thing is that, to me, is that we recognize that the numbers themselves aren't the enemy.
Oh, I agree. Yeah. I agree.
That's what I mean.
When you came out with this statement at the beginning of the alpha test document about the mechanics just being mechanics and producing effects, and that, for example, you didn't have to pay for Tony Stark's wealth or his company or anything. Right. I suddenly went, oh, this is the problem I've had, is I've tried to always put
everything
in one category
in there.
Or the other.
Right.
Either one category or the other. And by saying you only need to put the parts of the game that need to be quantified in the quantified category.
And the unquantified ones are still concrete imaginatively, and they still interact with the parts that are quantified. Yeah. That's what I'm really aiming at. So I appreciate that. This has been really helpful to break this down.